Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The show where we do reviews and deep dives into various albums out there, So today we're returning back to the incredibly wide and vast world of Room 40 and its incredible plethora of album releases. And I wanted to say before starting this, navigating Room 40 on Bandcamp, I feel like, especially with this record label, it's like rummaging around through a chest of old photographs and memories that you haven't dived through in such a long while. And whatever you pull out, though, is something that is incredibly peculiar and interesting in its own right. And especially going through the Bandcamp, you scroll through the discography and go through all the various pictures that can go past and stuff. You end up finding things that for various reasons or whatever just pull you in, and you find yourself listening to something just new, different and interesting. And I mention this because this is an album that did just that. I was going through Bandcamp, spotted the album art and was like, what's going on here? What does this sound like? And then when I listened to this particular album, I ended up forming this incredibly contemplative listening experience with it. So today I'm going to present that album to you. I present Demora by Luís Fernandes. So as always, let's ask ourselves, who is Luís Fernandes? Well, Fernandes is an artist hailing from Braga, Portugal, who sort of got known for releasing music under the moniker of The Astro Boy, as well as being the guitarist for the alternative rock group Pixie Aviar. I don't know how that's said, but to be honest with you, as always, I always butcher names, don't I? Anyway, after releasing a couple of albums under these names, as well as some collaborative albums with one Joana Gama, we find ourselves in 2019, where Fernandes himself releases a solo album under his own name, the very same album we're looking at today, Demora. So what is Demora? It is a 5-track album comprised of a single take of Fernandes performing, music on the modular synthesizer. What this gives us is this incredible album experience that flows from track to track with this really phenomenal pacing that starts off gradually, and then before you realise it, you're already high up in the clouds. It's a wonderful album experience that I actually think this is probably going to be quite popular with fans of the likes of Tim Hecker or even Room 40's label owner Lawrence English, for example. It's kind of got this granular, heavy style to it, but the momentum of it is truly phenomenal. But yeah, what does Demora mean? So I think it's actually worth going into. Demora, it roughly translates to delay, in Portuguese of course. And according to the liner notes, depending on the way you use it in a sentence, it can also mean something that is taking too long. It's making someone wait for someone or something. And so this very point, this is worth bearing in mind when listening to this album, as it's it's almost this core theme that runs throughout the entirety of the experience. But yeah, going back to that album experience, listening to Demora, it feels like the audio equivalent of taking a running star, gliding past everything in this ferocious blur as you just take off into the sky, zooming past everything. I genuinely don't know how else to describe it though, as each track just moves from the next to the next and you barely even notice the transitions, Sometimes it sort of fades into silence, but I genuinely, when I first heard this, don't remember that happening because I'm just so taken and swept by the journey, if that makes sense. And yeah, it's interesting because some of the ideas feel very subtle on this and some feel quite dramatic and foreboding, but it's phenomenal though. It's I really enjoy in albums tracks that complement each other in terms of how they move from one movement to the next, and Demora does this incredibly well. But regardless, let's get into the 5 tracks on here, shall we? Demora opens up with Rising Edge, a 5-minute track of this peculiar sweeping clusters of noise that slowly starts to pull up these enveloping drones. And this peculiar pace to the track itself, though, like this, it uses that sort of granular synthesis to sort of pull you into this very dreamy, peculiar soundscape as the drones themselves start the process of acceleration, pushing you upward and onwards through the sky. And I love how subtle those movements actually seem, though. You sit down and listen to this thing, and each musical element and motif, they just slowly fade into the soundscape, introducing itself in such a slow way that it feels like time has truly been stretched out. And as the track reaches its end, we get this effortless glide into the second track, Fractured Harmony with Pulse, which continues this pushing tempo and myriad of synthesized notes circulating the instruments in its pattern. It's brilliant. There's this wonderful interconnectivity, I feel, to the music on this particular track. It's so peculiar. It takes these seemingly random notes and intertwines themselves within themselves to create this wonderful, pacing, this wonderful tempo that just pushes it all along further and further and further, continuing that acceleration. And it's so exciting as well, actually, It's a wonderful expression of the very sentiments of this album trying to present its core concepts and ideas. And as well with this track, though, about halfway into this particular track, those assorted notes all start to fade into the background, and the drones that we've been hearing start to come to the forefront, backed up by this very peculiar pulse of bass notes that I find so satisfying in their own right, before that too fades out. And it's here we find ourselves high up in the clouds, high above everything, wondering how and when did we even get here? And so from here, Demora leads arguably into the main sections of this album, the album's title track of Demora Part 1 and Part 2. And for me, listening to these 2 tracks, especially one into the other, it feels like gliding through the air itself, through the very clouds as the sunlight's nearly blinding you as its rays bounce across the top of the world, basically. And it's arguably my favourite section of this album, though. With it, you get this myriad of drones that are colliding and intertwining into this beautiful section for roughly around 5 minutes, before you get this amazing, beautiful drop of droning bass notes that just become this phenomenal pushing element for the track itself. It feels like the deep echoing of the rumbling of the world itself. And I'll be honest here, actually. One of my favourite things in drone music is when you have a build-up of drones happening, and then suddenly that bass just drops right into the mix. There's something that's so satisfying and lovely about it when it's done really, really nicely. And with this album, Demora, taking roughly about 20 minutes to reach such a point, it makes the whole build-up of the album experience feel so worth it, I feel. It helps push along more of the album's core themes and concepts as well. Is this perhaps the Demora that we've been waiting for since the opening track? What we're being delayed to? As for my personal interpretation of listening to this album, I'd argue so. And though it should be noted that this doesn't downplay the rest of the album, though, that the build-up as well is so just brilliant and satisfying, and it's perfect to just let ourselves get lost within it all the movements as we barely even notice the album's progression. And as it is, we would barely even notice that this album was pushed onward into Demora Part 2, which seems to act as a final scene for this whole album story and concept. Once again, those drones are pushed even further and further. It's pushed it so far by now, before it completely drowns us in this beautiful ambient collage. And how I interpret the story coming along, as I've scattered throughout this text, very esoterically, I feel like so much of this album plays along like the takeoff of an aircraft in particular, climbing up towards the sky. And so for me, and I imagine I get this interpretation from looking at the album's artwork, but for me, Demora Part 2, it feels like the switching off of the engine itself. the closing of one's eyes and the terrifying, fascinating freefall one would experience inside the vehicle as gravity takes over and pulls you back towards the ground. There's something terrifying about it, but also weirdly fascinating, I feel. And I imagine a part of me experienced this, purely because of the album artwork, right? I'll go into this a bit later, actually, but to get back to it, Demora Part 2, it continues to build up and up before we reach the climax of the track's conclusion. And then when you get there, you just find yourself in this beautifully serene and awe-inspiring landscape, it leading us straight into the album's epilogue, basically. So, Demora finishes off with its final track, Refracted Cloud. This is another intertwined swirling miasma of drones, basically, feeling very peculiar and serene, yet oddly ominous within its own right. And in a weird way, this one kind of has me envisioning the reverse of everything that's just happened, In a sort of fast-forward motion, we don't just return to the ground itself, but we literally just experience the entirety of it all backwards, as though someone's pressed rewind. And it's a bit of an odd interpretation, but I thought there was something interesting about that, so I thought I'd mention it, basically. But yeah, it then fades out, though, leaving us safely back on the ground, intact and safe. And thus, Demora concludes, fading out into this very gentle silence. And so, yeah, this is a very peculiar album of sorts, I think, I don't know why, but I just found myself really pulled by this album when I first heard it, and then the more I read about it and, listened to it and stuff, the more I just really got into it, basically. I think there's this real subtlety to the movements, which, although it's actually quite loud and, Tim Heckery, it's still very oddly subtle. And they truly take their time, to introduce elements which are then used to sort of push along the narrative itself. And it's so peculiar. I'm just drawn in by so many different things about this album, starting off in particular with the intriguing album artwork, of course. And so let's discuss that for a bit, shall we? In the beginning, I did mention crawling through Room 40 and finding myself drawn to various albums based on the artwork. And Demora was one of those various albums, It stood out to me purely based on the picture here. The image of, a helicopter suspended in this free-falling state, it just really stood out to me. And looking up just the picture at the time, it conjured up such an emotion of intrigue and curiosity, and even fear as well. I look at this picture and find myself actually feeling some sort of level of terror and tension, because the way this aircraft is just placed in the middle of the air, in this, perfectly in the middle of the frame as well. And it's just, it's facing the wrong direction, basically. It's, it's like it's falling backwards, basically. It's so peculiar, I mentioned here, there's many reasons why individuals are drawn to artistic creations, whatever they may be. And I find it interesting that Demora initially drew me in with its album artwork, and it then created this listening experience that held me in this really peculiar stasis for roughly 40 minutes or so, that enveloped me in this really beautiful sonic but also weirdly terrifying soundscape, I don't know why particular albums have the impacts they do sometimes, but especially in these cases, I'm really grateful for when they do, because I find the notion that just a random work can have this kind of impact absurdly interesting, and that's basically why I wanted to do a dive of Demora on the channel, because I just really enjoy this one. There's something truly fascinating about it to me. And so with that, I think we're going to come to the end of today's strange episode of Weird Music. Demora, it's certainly peculiar, but it operates as this wonderfully engrossing, dark ambient drone album that is full of, movement and the core theme of delay. And yeah, it completely plays on the very notion of delay, the very usage of the word in Portuguese as well, as we mentioned earlier. Now, I think there's something very interesting and amusing there. But yeah, it just creates this wonderful listening experience for us that is truly fascinating, And so, yeah, if you have enjoyed today's episode of Weird Music, then feel free to check out Demora by Luís Fernandes by following the links below, of course, as well as checking out all his albums, and even, have a go at trawling through Room 40 yourself. Maybe you'll be drawn in by a particular album artwork, and if you have been, feel free to suggest that in the comments. I'd love to have more reasons to check out Room 40 albums. But for now though, I'd like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.